Hey everybody, it's Ron, and I want to tell you a story about business and how that story changed everything. The pen barely made a sound. In the Oval Office in Washington, D.C., on the morning of June 19, 1987, Ronald Reagan sat at his desk and did something most Americans pictured completely wrong. He wasn't stamping a bill rejected or vetoed. He wasn't crossing anything out. A president who vetoes a bill doesn't sign it at all. He does the opposite. He signs a separate piece of paper entirely, a formal letter laying out exactly why he's refusing to approve it, and sends that letter, along with the untouched bill, back to whichever chamber of Congress sent it to him in the first place. No signature ever touches the bill itself. The rejection lives in the letter. The bill in question was Senate Bill 742, the Fairness in Broadcasting Act, a measure that would have locked a decades-old broadcasting rule permanently into federal law. Reagan's letter ran 2 pages, and the language was sharp. He called the rule antagonistic to the freedom of expression guaranteed by the First Amendment. Congress read the letter, counted their votes, and didn't even attempt to override him. The bill was dead. If you'd been reading the newspapers that week, you might have thought this was the whole story. A president defending an old broadcasting rule against a Congress trying to lock it into law. But Reagan's signature that morning wasn't the end of anything. It was the piece that had to fall first. Congress had been racing to codify the rule before anyone could touch it, and now that path was closed. The only body left with the power to actually kill the rule for good was a group even most Washington reporters weren't watching closely. 4 commissioners at the Federal Communications Commission, sitting on a vote they'd been circling for months. So what actually gets written into law when a president says no to something? What clears once that fight is settled? And how did one signature on June 19, 1987, opened the door for a second decision 6 weeks later on August 4th that would quietly reshape what an entire generation heard on the radio and watched on the TV. From Business Basics, I'm Ron Trucks, and this is Business History, the daily podcast where we explain the stories that changed business forever. Every date on the calendar has a story where business reshaped the world. Today, August 4th, that story takes us to 1987. The vote nobody was watching. The rule that President Reagan's veto was protecting didn't start as a political weapon. It started as a math problem. Way back in 1949, the Federal Communications Commission, the federal agency that regulates the country's airwaves, introduced what was called the Fairness Doctrine, because there were only so many broadcast frequencies available in any given city for radio and the new television that was gaining traction. Whoever held one of those licenses controlled a genuinely scarce public resource. The Fairness Doctrine required those license holders to cover controversial issues and to give airtime to more than one side of each one. The Supreme Court backed that logic in 1969 in a case called Red Lion Broadcasting versus FCC, ruling that because the airwaves themselves were limited, the government had a legitimate interest in making sure one broadcaster couldn't monopolize the public conversation. For years, that argument held, because it was true. A handful of stations in any market meant a handful of voices, and the doctrine kept any one of them from shutting the others out. Then the scarcity started disappearing. By the mid-1980s, cable television had multiplied the number of channels available to an average household many times over, and the FCC itself, under Chairman Mark Fowler, commissioned a study in 1985 that reached an uncomfortable conclusion. The doctrine wasn't just outdated, it was actively backfiring. A good portion of the stations across the country had decided it was safer to avoid controversial topics altogether than risk a complaint over how they'd covered them. Broadcasters had wanted the doctrine gone for years, since compliance was expensive and the rules were vague enough to invite constant legal risk. Lawmakers, on the other side, sought something different, a real check on concentrated media power that kept the airwaves honest for decades. By the summer of 1987, both sides were racing towards the same finish line from opposite directions. Congress moved first, passing a bill to lock the doctrine permanently into federal law before the FCC could act on its own, and then Reagan vetoed it. Congress's bill landed on Reagan's desk in mid-June, and he had 10 days to act. On June 19, 1987, he sent it back unsigned, along with that two-page letter laying out exactly why. His objection centered on one argument. Requiring broadcasters to balance their coverage was, in his words, content-based regulation that ran against the First Amendment, the constitutional guarantee protecting free speech and a free press. As I mentioned, Congress read the letter, counted votes, and didn't even attempt to override the veto. The bill was dead, but the doctrine itself was still very much alive, sitting exactly where it had always sat, inside FCC policy rather than federal law. That left the actual decision in the hands of 4 people. On August 4, 1987, FCC Chairman Dennis Patrick called a vote in front of his fellow commissioners. There was no drawn-out debate on the floor that day, because the real fight had already happened over the 2 years leading up to it, through Fowler's research, through months of internal argument, through the mounting case that scarcity no longer justified the rule. The vote came back 4-0. Patrick told the room afterward that the FCC was extending to broadcasters the same First Amendment guarantees that the print media have enjoyed since our nation's inception. Not everyone in Washington agreed the fight was over and that it had been fought fairly. Members of Congress pushed back hard in the days that followed, arguing the FCC had tried to flout the will of Congress and calling the decision wrong-headed, misguided, and illogical. Both sides were arguing from real conviction. One side defending a First Amendment principle, the other defending a public interest safeguard, and neither side was simply posturing. The mechanism under both moments was simple, even if politics around it weren't. A regulation built on scarcity only holds up while the scarcity is real. The moment cable and a flood of new outlets made that scarcity disappear, the legal foundation went with it. And once the requirement to balance a broadcast vanished, stations were free to build their programming around whatever actually kept people listening. The first real test of what that freedom was worth came fast. Less than a year later, on August 1, 1988, a radio host named Rush Limbaugh launched his show into national syndication out of New York City, built entirely around a single host opinion with no legal obligation to include an opposing one. It caught on immediately, and within a few years he was reaching millions of listeners a week, proving something advertisers hadn't been able to test under the old rules, that certainty and conflict could hold an audience better than balanced ever had. The format spread because the economics behind it worked. Talk radio grew into a business worth billions of dollars in advertising revenue across hundreds of stations nationwide. Cable news, which had never technically fallen under the doctrine's rules to begin with, built its own programming on the same underlying logic once it saw talk radio's numbers. Since opinion-driven coverage reliably outperformed straight, balanced reporting in the ratings that advertisers actually paid for. Neither industry invented the appetite. They simply built a business model designed to feed it, once nothing was legally requiring them to do otherwise. None of this makes Reagan's veto or Patrick's vote dishonest. The First Amendment argument behind both decisions was real, grounded in genuine Supreme Court precedent and a genuine shift in how many voices the airwave could actually hold. It also happened to be enormously profitable for every industry it touched. Both of those things were true on August 4th, 1987, at the exact same time, and that overlap, a real principle and a real profit motive pointing the same direction, is exactly why the decision never got seriously challenged again. I'm Ron Trucks, and this is Business History, the podcast that finds the turning points behind the headlines. To hear more stories like this, follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen. And if you're enjoying the stories, don't forget to subscribe and leave a quick review. It helps more people find the story behind the business. And if you want to actually understand business better without the fluff or the buzzwords or the MBA language, start by visiting us at businessdailypodcast.com.